Good afternoon, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Cooley, and I am the Education and Outreach Manager for the State Historical Museum. Today's Iowa History 101 webinar focuses on Iowans as they marched toward and fought for women's suffrage. The webinar is also part of the State Historical Society's 19th Amendment Centennial Celebration. American women started voting nationwide after the 19th Amendment went into effect on August 26, 1920. 100 years later, the State Historical Society of Iowa commemorates that milestone with a series of programs and events through August. Please refer to our website, iowaculture.gov/history, to learn more about all of our upcoming programming. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in a few days. I have disabled the chat function, but if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague Matt Beyer is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note, we may not be able to get to all of the questions. Now I'm happy to introduce our speaker, State Curator Leo Landis. Leo has his Bachelor's of Science in History from Iowa State University and a Master's of Arts in Historical Administration from Eastern Illinois University. He has completed all but his dissertation towards a PhD in history from Iowa State. His museum experience includes time at Living History Farms in Urbandale, Connor Prairie in Fishers, Indiana, and 8 years as curator at Henry Ford Museum and Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan. He also worked as curator and director of education at Salisbury House in Des Moines. Now I'm very happy to turn it over to Leo to begin the webinar.
Well, thank you, Jennifer, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. As Jennifer said, I'm Leo Landis, State Curator, and there's been a lot of work that's been done on this topic. And I just want to acknowledge, past scholars and historians, people like Louise Nowen, Rosenfield Nowen, people like Dorothy Schweeder. I relearned some stories too, and doing some work looking at what more recent scholarship like Sarah Egge has done, and that Rebecca Connard, who was a colleague and friend, did some oral histories in the 1970s of women who voted for the first time. And so there's some great resources out there that other people have done, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk on this topic when there are so many people that have done great work. And I'm just kind of sharing some of my own research, but also a lot of their research too. So that said, here you see a clipping from the Esterville Daily News of 1890, October 23rd, saying, "Put yourself in her place. We often wonder," says Women's Standard, "how many men have ever really tried to put themselves in a woman's place. Fancy a man brought to trial before a court composed entirely of women. Fancy a man going year after year to pay taxes when he was denied representation. Fancy him bearing, year after year, the burden of work for the churches with no voice in their councils. Fancy him sitting quietly, listening to the average 4th of July speech, declaring this to be a government of the people when he knew half the people were disenfranchised. Can anyone imagine a man in such a situation holding his peace, and would anyone respect him for a moment if he knew he did? Yet he has no more at stake in government than woman has. It involves his dearest interests, but so it does hers. She is equally amenable with him to every law. Who is more concerned than woman in every law affecting the home, property, marriage, and divorce, and who has greater stake in war? In short, though woman cannot lift her finger to change the law, she is not therefore exempt. The law does not let her alone. It interferes in all her affairs at every step, from the cradle to the grave." And this was the frustration that women across Iowa and across the nation were facing, at least in most states. Again, keep in mind that suffrage is controlled by the states, though federal constitutional amendments can impose a federal guideline, but really voting and suffrage requirements, as evidenced by Governor Reynolds issuing the felon voting, lifting the felon voting requirement in Iowa recently. So that's something left to the states. And so women across Iowa really were frustrated. Most women were frustrated by their inability to participate in the laws and the elections that, and the men who were serving that created the laws governing their lives. And so we'll talk about that, but this is just a really great reference to how women were feeling. And the women's standard, that's a small typo. It was the woman's standard. That's the Iowa Equal Suffrage Association's newspaper. So Iowa, we'll talk about this a little bit later, did have its own equal suffrage newspaper beginning in 1886. Just a little bit of background. Those of you who've participated in these know I like to do a little timeline to kick things off. In 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention is held in New York. Amelia Jinks Bloomer attended. She would become an Iowan, as we'll talk about. And this was one that wasn't just dedicated to suffrage, it was dedicated to women's rights in general, but really is one of the foundational events in United States history on initiating women's suffrage and women's activism in a political sphere. On the Iowa side, Frances Dana Gage, who was born in Ohio but was living in Missouri, is one of the first speakers to do a little bit of travel across Iowa and speak on temperance and women's rights. That's in 1854. In 1854, Amelia Bloomer and her husband Dexter moved to Council Bluffs, and Amelia would publish a magazine or newspaper called The Lily out of Council Bluffs for a number of years that was an important women's voice. And so that's a really important landmark from an Iowa standpoint. Also, what you start to see arising in the national conversation about women's suffrage is the term free love. And in the Victorian or the mid-19th century phrasing, free love was not the 1960s version, but was equally as inflammatory for people, especially people that were concerned about changes in American society. Free love at the time essentially meant divorce, that if a woman was not feeling fulfilled in a relation, a marriage, that she could petition for divorce without any strings. And up into, in many cases, the 1930s and 1940s, divorce laws were somewhat restrictive. And so as the debate begins in the 1850s, this concept called free love, that a woman couldn't leave an abusive marriage because of the marriage contract being so sacrosanct, was tied to free love, and that women having the vote would then lead to more liberal or open divorce laws and free love. And so that was viewed as a threat to the morals of American society. From an Iowa standpoint, you do see after the Civil War, the Iowa legislature, again, this is all men, and in fact, all white men. So I rarely in the pre-1920 period will use the term voters in Iowa. I'll almost always say men. That a legislative study committee was formed for suffrage, and that was both to strike the word white from our Constitution and perhaps strike the word male. Those were the two restrictions on suffrage. When Iowa becomes a state in late 1846, our Constitution reserves suffrage to white males 21 and older who are residents. So those are the requirements, and the residency was a fairly short term. By 1869, Iowa women are forming formal suffrage societies. So the Northern Iowa Women's Suffrage Association is formed in Dubuque. Mary Newberry Adams, we have a great portrait of her in the museum collection of Dubuque. She was active in that, and in fact, she attends the Western Women's Suffrage Association in Chicago that same year. Then the statewide Women's Suffrage Association, the Iowa Women's Suffrage Association, is formed in Mount Pleasant in 1870. In 1871, the Iowa legislature had passed, and perhaps most of our participants today know, to change the Iowa Constitution, you have to have the legislature vote in 2 consecutive sessions. So not 2 consecutive years, but in 2 consecutive sessions. And in through the early 1900s, and in fact, even later, the Iowa legislature met every other year. So there would be an election, and then the Iowa legislature would meet, and they would not meet the following year. So different than what we're accustomed to today. So the legislature had passed the white males had passed a bill to put before a referendum to the voters of Iowa, in this case being white and African-American men, because the word white was struck in the year 1868 from our Constitution. And it was going through the legislature for another time in the early 1870s, and Victoria Woodhull, a US citizen and by birth a person from the US, but had married a British man, she gave a lecture and was nationally known, advocating that concept of free love. And newspapers carry a critique of this across the state. And so in 1871, though it had passed to the legislature in a previous session, the Iowa legislature fails to pass the suffrage bill a second time. So it never goes to the male voters of Iowa to be considered in a referendum situation to change the Constitution. In 1886, as I referenced, the Iowa suffrage newspaper, the Woman's Standard, is initiated. 1888, Susan B. Anthony helps form the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And so that becomes the national advocacy group. There'd been competing groups, and so the National American Women's Suffrage Association is the national advocacy group for suffrage. Then 1908, as we'll see in a later photo, there's a suffrage parade in Boone, which is one of the nation's first suffrage parades. I was dubious of that, but did the research, and I couldn't find anything in the US really connected to that. So good for Iowa women. Then in 1916, the Iowa men do reject an equal suffrage amendment by more than 10,000 votes. In 1917, there's a national effort, and Alice Paul and others begin picketing the White House. It's the first time that pickets engage in direct action at the White House. And so we're just about to enter World War I. World War I has been raging in Europe, and while that tumult is happening, Alice Paul, shortly before, a few months before US entry into the war, starts picketing at the White House for women's suffrage. The war really does consume most people's attention in the United States through 1917 and 1918, but then suffrage, as we will talk about, does gain momentum, and the 19th Amendment process is engaged. Iowa passes its bill in July of 1919, and then Tennessee becomes the 36th state just about 100 years ago, August 18th, 1920, that then cements the opportunity for women to vote across the country. And Carrie Lane Chapman Catt of Charles City, Iowa State College, now Iowa State University alumnus, is the one who really does lead that effort across the nation through the late teens. So there's your overview, perhaps not quite as quick as I wanted to do, but we're going to talk from Amelia Bloomer to Carrie Chapman Catt a little bit on this topic. We had them in the timeline. And so looking at suffrage, you need to look at it in the context, and I've talked about this in the temperance talk and to a degree in the Iowa State Fair talk, where the reform movements of the 1840s and the 1850s and even prior to that, suffrage is all connected to that. And so when you look at suffrage and suffrage activity, you can look at it within the framework of anti-slavery activity before the Civil War, temperance activity, and then suffrage activity. In fact, in notes from the Iowa Suffrage Memorial Commission that appear in the Annals of Iowa in 1924, the reference does say the great triangle of progressive movements of the 19th century were slavery, temperance, and suffrage. And you even get that being referenced in the 1880s in this Waterloo Courier article. The full article was on the left. Here's the clipping that makes it a little easier to read and really does talk about how slavery and temperance are connected. And so it's discussing a lecture from Margaret Campbell of Des Moines on the question of the hour that took place at the Congregational Church in Waterloo, and concerns about women being outside of their sphere. But in addition to talking about suffrage, Ms. Campbell also, and it's in the last paragraph on the right column, saying that Sunday evening, Ms. Campbell spoke on the life and public work of William Lloyd Garrison. She expected to have delivered a temperance lecture in the Baptist church, but owing to a decision of the Ministerial Association of this city, the question of temperance is not to be discussed at the present time. Mrs. Campbell paid a deserved tribute to the memory of Mr. Garrison in speaking of his advocacy of liberty for the oppressed during the days of slavery. His avowed sentiments for the right often led him into serious difficulties. The lecture was fairly well attended. So here you see women who are gaining a voice and connecting the activities and reforms of the earlier part of the century to activities connected to suffrage. And I referenced Francis Gage. Here's a nice little article from the Muscatine Tri-Weekly Journal talking about Francis Gage traveling Iowa in the 1850s. She comes in 1854 and also on a couple of other occasions. And so she spoke in Keokuk and Fairfield for sure on her trip in June of '54. And again, speaking on temperance and women's rights, so emphasizing those activities. And as I referenced in the timeline, and here's the announcement from the Daily Davenport Democrat about the Northern Iowa Women's Suffrage Association, and you can see who the founders and the leaders are. And usually that corresponding secretary in this case, and this is one of the challenges in researching these women, is they are generally referred to by their husbands' names, as was common even into the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s in some cases in newspapers. And so Mary Newberry Adams is the corresponding secretary of the Northern Iowa Women's Suffrage Association. They really are the ones who are, there may be a president, but that's much like any club. The president leads the meeting, secretary records notes, but the corresponding secretary in a lot of cases is doing the heavy work. And so the last component of that note talks about anyone who sympathizes with this movement and wishes to cooperate by organizing their own associations and should communicate with our corresponding secretary. And I know I was paraphrasing that, but you get the gist. And then, as we said, you've got the Iowa Women's Suffrage Association forming, and it is a convention that takes place in June in 1870 in Mount Pleasant. Mount Pleasant, with what is today Iowa Wesleyan University, was a hotbed of reform activity. And so the Iowa Women's Suffrage Society is formed there. And you look at the president, you've got Henry O'Connor, but you've got Amelia Bloomer as a vice president. The recording secretary is Annie Savory. Again, it calls her Mrs. J.C. Savory. And so if you're ever researching these folks, if they are married, it's good to know their husbands' names, because if you're doing a newspaper search, it's almost always going to, many cases, I shouldn't say always, because you see Amelia Bloomer, but in the case of Annie Savory, she's Mrs. J.C. Savory. So some names of folks that are prominent activists in that pre-1875 really is a bit of a break when the whole free love controversy dooms the Iowa effort at changing our Constitution. So here's your account of the Iowa Women's Suffrage Convention, the first one to have a statewide activity. A lot of folks know too, Belle or Arabella Mansfield, the first woman to receive a law license in Iowa. She was also active in this group. She was down in Mount Pleasant, so she would be active in the Iowa Women's Suffrage Association, or Society, I should say. And realize this one's a little tough to read, but this is Annie Savory's long account of "We do not support free love." She's trying to salvage the legislative process. And so the Des Moines, Iowa State Register, what is today the Des Moines Register, carries her comments on the activities of the Iowa Women's Suffrage Society and Suffrage Association. And so it really runs, almost a column and a half. So on the far left is the full length of her account of the activities of the Iowa Women's Suffrage Convention that took place, and the activities of the women suffragists in the state. And so I'll really look at the section that she wraps up. I just wanted to show you how long it ran, and it is all connected to the free love movement and references Victoria Woodhull as well. So saying, in the contest for the ballot, I shall cooperate with anyone who is loyal to the principle of political equality, irrespective of any opinion they may have upon any other question. And whenever a convention of which I am a member is assembled for the purpose of discussing women's rights to the ballot, and will so far let down its dignity and self-respect as to descend to personal abuse, or shall interpose the Bible as a condition precedent to membership, I shall always be found opposing it. And the resolution was that the association denounces the doctrine of free love. This is in the second from the left section of that article, and it's in the first column there, about halfway down, a third of the way down. And it says, resolved that this association denounces the doctrine of free love, believing that marriage is sacred and binding on all good men and women of Iowa, and that the Bible is the palladium of our liberties. So Iowa women are religious in most accounts. So are men on most accounts, not in, but on most accounts. Dorothy Schweeder, who I had as a professor at Iowa State when I was in grad school, and writes about this in her Iowa, the Middle Land. There's no defining factor on Iowa society more in the 19th century than religion. And so assuring Iowa men and other Iowa women that the idea of free love is abhorrent to them, and that they are going to adhere to the Bible as the foundation of liberty is part of the argument here. And so they do not convince Iowa men that they're not advocates of free love. And of course, the initiative in the 1870s, when it had looked so promising for Iowa women, ultimately fails. And so by 1875, the efforts to change the Iowa Constitution that had a lot of momentum after the Civil War have really had to take on a new direction. And just as a reference to some of those early women and who they were that were making those arguments as reformers, you do have people across the state. So Narcissa Bemis in Buchanan, kind of northeast Iowa, Amelia Bloomer, who we referenced over in western Iowa in Council Bluffs, a number of women from central Iowa, so Margaret Campbell, Mary Jane Coggeshall, Martha Callanan, Eliza Heaton Hunter, Carolyn Ingham, and Carolyn Ingham's family. The Inghams published the Algona paper, but also then would come to Des Moines and be co-owners of the Register. And so she was a significant leader not just in north central Iowa, but eventually her family in central Iowa as well. And then Mariah Orwig in Polk County. Charlotta Piles is an African-American woman who had grown up in Kentucky prior to the Civil War and is an advocate for equality. And Kristen Corey and Eric Morse with their program. I'd encourage you to watch that or see the exhibit they did. And we also had an Iowa palimpsest article on her in the 1920s that we'll share with our email tomorrow. But Charlotta Piles is an important and often under-recognized story as a woman activist in Iowa. And so in southeast Iowa in Lee County, Keokuk. Lizzie Reed in Kossuth County, Annie Savory, who we referenced in Polk County. As you see a list in a Des Moines paper, I think is where I drew this, and I'm sorry I don't have the reference, but the name listed was Susan Sharman. I'm almost sure that that's Hoyt Sherman's spouse, Susan Sherman, and then Mary Work in Polk County. So these are some of those early women in that pre-1875 era, and even a little bit later in some instances, who really are the voices of women for women's suffrage in Iowa. And there's a nice shot of Charlotta Piles, and this is a Des Moines Register and Leader piece as women's suffrage was again getting steam in the 19-teens connected to the temperance movement and prohibition. The Register actually did a feature section in May of 1915 on women's suffrage, or woman's suffrage. Woman's suffrage was the more period term, or women's suffrage. I tend to say women's suffrage. And so there you see Eliza Heaton Hunter, Martha Callanan, and Mary Jane Coggeshall. And my colleague Becky Plunkett has done a great job, and so does my colleague Mary Bennett in the Historical Society, on sharing these stories. Becky has done a great post on some of this material on our Flickr page that we'll share in our email tomorrow as well. And speaking of Mary Jane Coggeshall and Martha Callanan, and talking about the Woman's Standard, that newspaper. So the State Historical Society of Iowa does have these available on microfilm. When our research centers are open to the public again, you can look at these. But here is a copy, and I'm thankful to a colleague who let me have access to the microfilm yesterday as I wore my mask. And you see volume 1, number 1 of the Woman's Standard, the Iowa Suffrage monthly newspaper. And it was published out of Des Moines. It actually moved around. For a while, it was either published in Sutherland or I'm almost sure it was Sutherland up in northwest Iowa. Mary Jane Coggeshall had left, I think, as editor by that time, but it didn't always stay in Des Moines. But here you see volume 1, number 1, and just as a reference, again, connecting it to the other reform movements. This is on page 1 on the lower half, reporting from the Woman's Tribune, another newspaper dedicated to suffrage and issues, saying, I wish all sermons out of the church. I wish all the women of the United States who have drunken husbands or sons would form themselves into an army to march from the Atlantic to the Pacific to burn the saloons. I would gladly be the torchbearer and set every fire myself. I heard these words that savor so strongly of anarchy fall from the lips of a woman who has waged war on intemperance from my earliest recollections a few weeks ago, as she saw her intoxicated husband coming through the gate. A woman who has raised 2 sons under the shadows of a church and yet has seen them follow in their father's footsteps. Her desperate cry is, there is no remedy, is there no remedy, was to me the strongest appeal for more rights for women that I have ever listened to. And then Ellen G. Shields in Woman's Tribune. So again, not only are women advocating for suffrage, they are advocating for alcohol reform as well. And just as a reference to that, in the Journal of the Iowa General Assembly in 1900, there was a petition issued to the legislature from the Methodist, Baptist, and United Presbyterian churches in Goldfield, Iowa, so north central, and saying to Senator Wallace, who had received the petition that we citizens of Goldfield have noted with interest the contest between the citizens of Des Moines and the saloon power, and recognizing that the result affects more or less our entire state, hereby express our protest against any legislation in favor of the liquor traffic, and respectfully petition your honorable body to so vote and enact such laws as will conserve the interests of all the people. And then the next line in the Journal of the Senate is Senator Mullen presented the petition of 398 women of Black Hawk County, Iowa, in favor of striking the word male from the state constitution. Also a petition of 230 voters on same subject referred to the Committee on Constitutional Amendments and Suffrage. So the Iowa legislature is hearing, A, we need to reform alcohol and prohibit it, and B, we need to give the vote to women. And the two things, as we have said, are concurrent and simpatico. And just again, this may be the last reference I make, but as part of that connection between prohibition and women's suffrage, and this is the lead up to the 1916 referendum that takes place in Iowa and runs in the Daily Freeman Tribune from Webster City, so north central Iowa, saying, apropos of women's suffrage and prohibition, an editorial recently appeared in the Mason City Times. The last two lines of the editorial are to the point. The editorial is as follows. The most effective argument equal suffrage speakers and writers have used to secure votes for women has been the influence of women will have on the temperance question if given the ballot. And so this again goes on to talk about if we give women the vote, essentially, it's important for us to be aware, and in this case it's supportive, that this will be effective for prohibition. And Iowa Republicans, who were the dominant party in most instances, Horace Boys was the only Democrat to serve as a Democratic governor in the period from 1860 to the 1930s. So you really did have a dominant Republican Party. It also references that at the end, this is on the far right, about halfway down is the article ends, saying if prohibition is taken out, what foundation can equal suffrage advocates stand on? But comments that when William Jennings Bryan, who was a well-known Democrat from Nebraska, he had run on the Democratic presidential ticket in the 1890s and 1900, was speaking in Sioux City, and he was a proponent of equal suffrage and prohibition, but that Republicans were hesitant to be on the stage with William Jennings Bryan, even though he was speaking on a topic that most of them were sympathetic with. So people concerned about a lack of bipartisanship, that's not completely new and carried into the debates around women's suffrage. And just to recap a lot of that, what the cultural and social factors for suffrage were. If you were going to be pro-equal suffrage, you were generally pro-temperance, and you were generally Republican, and your faith was most likely Protestant, and especially rural. But if you were an urban Protestant, you were going to likely be in favor of women's suffrage or equal suffrage. So those are the things to consider when you look at who was supporting suffrage. Were they Republican? Were they Protestant? Then they would likely be pro-temperance, and especially if you were a non-Catholic rural person, you also were going to support equal suffrage, or at least be open to it. There are some exceptions, as we'll see on a map a little bit later. And then those opposed to equal suffrage tended to favor local option on prohibition, tended to be Democratic in their political leanings. Most Catholics were not in favor, most Catholic men especially were not in favor of equal suffrage. And then if you were urban and perhaps Protestant or Catholic, you might be a little more opposed to equal suffrage. And that's because places like Keokuk, Davenport, Dubuque, Council Bluffs, Sioux City. An important part of river commerce was the legal sale of alcohol. So you might be a little more tolerant of alcohol sales if you were an urban Protestant. If you were an urban Catholic, that tended to dominate your religious background, and your political leanings tended to be Democratic, and so you would have been anti-equal suffrage. And again, another account from the Iowa General Assembly showing the activities besides people like Mary Jane Coggeshall and others from across the state advocating through newspapers, but also women from across the state would regularly petition the legislature in that post-1875 period through the 1880s and into the early 20th century. And so the Journal of the Senate would show the listings of petitions they received. So Senator Martis talks about 85 voters of Wayne County, and in that case, that's going to be men, asking that the word male be stricken from the state constitution. Senator Young from Lee County, so Wayne being south central, Lee County being southeast, asking that the word male, and this is 45 women petitioning, so women taking action as well, that the word male be stricken from the state constitution. Senator Tallman of Clark County, so just south of Des Moines, Governor Reynolds' home county, 111 men, 126 women, and also a petition of 421 women of Warren County. Warren is actually directly south. Clark is a couple of counties south, asking that the word male be stricken. And then Benton County in northeast Iowa, just adjacent to Lynn County up by Cedar Rapids, 264, might be a typo on my part, apologies, 264 men asking that the word male be stricken from the state constitution. And Senator Penrose of Benton County has a petition from 348 women. And so these petitions, and we have them in the state archives. My colleague Sharon Avery has told me about these. So in addition to being in the record, we have a number of original examples in the state archives of these petitions that were sent to the Iowa legislature or legislators through that period of activity with women and men seeking to have the word male struck from or stricken from the state constitution. And just to talk about some of those women who were active, here's a listing of some of the African-American women who were active in the suffrage movement and also showing their faith background. And Teresa Adams of Scott County, and I give a lot of credit to Kristen Corey and Eric Morris for leading me to most of these names. Some of them I knew, but not all of them. So Teresa Adams of Scott County, she was in Davenport. We're not quite sure when she passed away. In a census record, she lists her birth year and birth month as January of 1872. And she is in the Davenport City Directory, at least listed into 1925. She's no longer listed in 1926, and I haven't been able to find a death notice or any sort of obituary for Teresa Adams, but she was active. And these were segregated in most cases, not in most cases, these were segregated groups. So African-American women had their own suffrage societies in their communities. Sue Brown, who was incredibly significant in so many ways. She was originally from Monroe County as an Iowan, and then Polk County is where she and her husband, S. Joe Brown, who was a lawyer, settle. And she's a Methodist. I put the asterisk on Teresa Brown's because as you look at Vivian Smith's card there on the right, and we'll talk about her, the 1915 Iowa census would list your church affiliation. And Teresa Adams' census card of 1915 says none, but she is listed in both Davenport and Des Moines newspapers as being active in the Methodist Church. So I chose to list her as Methodist as opposed to none for Teresa Adams. Sue Brown is no doubt a Methodist. Helena Downey of Ottumwa is a Baptist. Gertrude Rush of Des Moines is a Baptist, the first African-American woman to practice law in Iowa. Vivian Smith-Watts of Waterloo, a really compelling story. That's her card on the right for the 1915 census. She had not completed her time at Iowa State Teachers College. Today, UNI in Cedar Falls. She lived in Waterloo, and so going to school in Cedar Falls was convenient. She went to the Teachers College and was just finishing up in 1915, but you see she's listed as Methodist, and that her parents were both born in Kentucky. And Maddie Woods of Polk County, research looks to show her being born in 1878 from what I found, and I could find her in the Polk County Des Moines City Directory into the 1940s, and a newspaper reference for her in 1942. And she's also a Methodist. It's interesting, and I'm still doing some work, and you'll see on the next slide, and I'll bring up some photos in a second as well, that because in the African American community, the Methodist, or the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME Church, so if you're researching this topic and you ever see AME listed for African American women, that's the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Methodism was strong and still has in its Book of Discipline guidelines on alcohol, but that was one of the foundations of Methodism. And in the African American community, Methodism was a stronger faith tradition than perhaps Congregational or Presbyterian. And so you see a lot of Methodist women who have African ancestry as being active. That's not as defined as what I found for women with European ancestry. So just a slight difference with African American women and their faith traditions versus the faith traditions of women with European ancestry. And that's the Iowa State Bystander, May 19th, 1916. Again, on that run up to the referendum on women's suffrage, they feature some of the women leaders in the African American communities across Iowa. And so here's a reference from actually the Bystander of May 19th, 1916, that does talk about Miss Teresa Adams above the Wednesday 2 p.m. section on the report of the suffrage chairman. So Teresa Adams of Davenport is the Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. She is their suffrage chair out of Davenport. So she was playing a big role. And so that's from that clipping from May 19th, 1916. And then a really great shot of Sue Brown, again referred to as Mrs. S. Joe Brown in this case. And she was nationally significant, such an important story in Iowa history. So she and her husband really advocated for equality and anti-racism across our state for so many years. And then again, an underappreciated story is Helena Downey of Ottumwa, and a really striking person. And so these are just some of those clippings from the Bystander. Again, on the run up to that June 1916 referendum, the Bystander is promoting the African American leaders in the suffrage community. And so here is a longer list of women's suffrage leaders, and I'll show you the plaque on which this is based, of women with European ancestry. And so on the plaque that is in today the Ola Babcock Miller building, but was the original historical department building, you've got Carrie Chapman Catt, Mary Adams, and I'm not going to dwell on this too long. I think it's worth calling out. These are women from all across the state. They were recognized on a plaque that's still in the Ola Babcock Miller building, but you see, at least as far as I've found so far, not a single Methodist woman listed, and that did surprise me. They tend to be Quakers, Congregationalists, Unitarians. Lanch Wolfe is a really compelling story. She and her husband worked in Charles City and had a long life in Charles City, but when they were deceased, they were both buried in the a Jewish cemetery in Chicago. So you will not see Landschneidig Wolf. They were, I believe, both Russian immigrants. I know her husband was, and I think she was as well. Really compelling list of women as well from across the state who are recognized on a plaque in the Ola Babcock Miller building as suffrage leaders. And so that new era of suffrage activity taking place after 1900, we talked about the Boone March, 1908. It really is where Iowa women stop just writing and petitioning and take direct action and are out marching on their behalf. And so there was a national speaker in Boone. It was several hundred people attended and marched from the Congregational Church. The church in the background here is actually the Methodist church that I believe still stands in Boone. And there is a marker at the Congregational Church where the march began. So this is from our collection here at the State Historical Society, a little blow up of it, seeing one of the signs saying taxation without representation is tyranny, as true now as in 1776. And so there you see a little blow up of that shot. And they also, women were, as we said, continuing to advocate and have events, bringing men in. Here's a nice postcard from our collection in Des Moines. In the Historical Society Research Center collection. Becky Plunkett was nice enough to scan this and talking about the activities taking place in 1910. So again, 1908, the Boone activity, 1910, activities across the state. And then seeing things as momentum is building, like suffrage songs with a J.N. Ding Darling cartoon on the front with women and in Sarah Egge's PhD dissertation from Iowa State, she talks about Carrie Dean Prune, a collection that we have, I believe, in Iowa City, who in May of 1916 puts a banner on her Buick, a la the woman on the left in her duster with the Votes for Women banner, but puts a sheet on her Buick and drives around Ida County in May of 1916. So these aren't just, representations on a postcard. Iowa women were out there actively campaigning in 1916. And a nice shot of a billboard. Again, this is from the Research Center collections. We don't quite know where this billboard was from, but again, encouraging Iowa men to vote yes to make Iowa the next state that supports women's suffrage. And yet, when the ballots are counted, initially the report is defeated by 5,000 votes. It's actually a 10,000 vote loss. And you'll see river counties did it. Wet communities cast an overwhelming vote against equal ballot amendment. There is at least one little exception to that, not just being the river towns with a sympathy. And when they say wet, again, I think a lot of the viewers today know wet means people in support of local option on alcohol, that anti-prohibition forces. So the wet communities cast an overwhelming vote against equal ballot. So there's your June 6th report on the equal suffrage amendment being defeated in Iowa. And it wasn't the Iowa Equal Suffrage Association that puts this map together, and this is one that is in our collections as well at the Research Center. So the yellow dots are the counties that voted in favor of the suffrage equality amendment. The white ones are those that did not. And so if you look along the Mississippi River, they're all white, from Lee County up to Allamakee and even some of the bordering counties. And then on the Missouri side and the Upper Sioux side, you do see that Pottawatomie County, Monona County, Woodbury, Plymouth, Sioux, and Lynn, and also Osceola and Cherokee vote against. I haven't done enough work on this, and I'd love to hear from my colleague Andrew Klump with the Annals of Iowa, but I suspect that the Dutch Reform sentiment doesn't think marriage or voting equality is the right direction. That's my gut on the Plymouth Sioux Lion initiative. It loses pretty handily in Sioux and Plymouth counties by 620 votes and 515 votes. 515 in Plymouth, 620 in Sioux. Cherokee, it only lost by I think 58 or 59. And then if you look at towns like, or counties like Carroll, Shelby, Crawford, and Audubon that are rural, those are big Catholic counties. So those counties, you think of Templeton Rye out of Carroll County and some of the other German ancestry communities that are in Shelby County, they do not want to give women the vote because that's going to affect their ability to consume alcohol. So those are some of the things to think about. And it was the Women's Christian Temperance Union of Iowa that created this map. And so the little triangles are counties that they see irregularities. And they even looked at counties that voted yellow, not just the counties that voted white. Good to know too that the Dutch communities up in Marion County, I should say, with Pella also votes against suffrage. So that's part of where I think some of that anti-suffrage may be coming in, not just Knoxville as the county seat, but perhaps with some of the Dutch ancestry there. But the suffrage went down, and again, this was created by the Iowa Women's Christian Temperance Union. And so they've had 12 types of irregularities and put these little cutout triangles. And so it'd be, votes unaccounted for, more votes than names on a list of voters, more votes than names marked X on list of voters where any are so marked. And so there was concern about voter fraud by the Iowa Women's Christian Temperance Union. And they created a map to show to their supporters and legislators on what they saw as irregularities across the board in counties that supported, but primarily the counties against. So, Dubuque and Jackson and Clinton County down to Scott and Lee and Louisa are all, or Wapello, excuse me. No, Louisa, there we go, are counties that don't support suffrage. So 10,000 votes, a little bit more. But July 1919, after World War I, the 19th Amendment gets legs. Women have used their actions in World War I to say, hey, we have supported the war effort, much like African Americans in Iowa did during the Civil War. And so in July, a special session is called, and Governor Harding calls it. There's Arch McFarland on the left, the Speaker of the Iowa House, on the right, signing the resolution. And then that's Governor Harding on the left, making his speech to the joint session of the Senate and the House. And so no dissenting votes in the Senate and 5 dissenting votes in the House. On July 2nd, the Iowa legislature passed the 19th Amendment. And we actually have the pen that Governor Harding used to sign the bill in the museum collection. And then Tennessee becomes the 36th state on August 18th, 1920. And so it does become law. And so women get the chance to vote, a nice little reference in the Muscatine paper on how registration is going for Iowa women, and saying that the number of Iowa women is about on par with Iowa men. And so here's that tablet that's in the Ola Babcock Miller building, showing the names. That was dedicated in 1931. The League of Women Voters was the successor organization to the Suffrage Association. Carrie Lane Chapman Catt had established the League of Women Voters. And then here's our memorial that's in the State House, dedicated to women's suffrage, and was dedicated by Carrie Chapman Catt in 1933, I believe, maybe shortly thereafter. And so we do have 2 memorials, or dedications to women, and I think it is worth pointing out that these did overlook the contributions of African American women in the suffrage movement. And so here's our legacy today. Iowans can kind of be proud. We're in the top 10 of average turnout. This is from the US News and World Report. I'd love to see us do better than Minnesota and Wisconsin for sure. And in fact, we're better in congressional voting sometimes than we are in presidential, at least based on the statistics in the US News and World Report story from December. But the only thing that I would wrap up with is saying, hey, Iowans, get out there and vote. It's something that people have fought for, women and African Americans across our state. It's one of the ways that you can help our country be governed by the people. And so it is the way you can help our nation and state be governed by the people. So get us up out of 8th place and let's move us into the top 5 for sure, ahead of Minnesota, goodness sake. So with that, thank you. Our next program is World War II on August 27th. And Matt, sorry, I meant to wrap up a couple minutes ago. So if we want to go a minute or two long, I'm fine.
Oh, you're fine, Leo. Well, thank you. We have a few minutes right now to answer some questions. However, before I pose the first question, I want to remind our participants that you can still submit your questions to the Q&A feature. But like we just said, we're on a schedule. So please note, we may not be able to get to all the questions before the end of the webinar. So our first question, Leo, is a pretty basic one, but it's a good encapsulation of what we talked about today. Can a tipping point be determined about why more people were in favor of women voting in the early 1900s?
It's all about prohibition. It really is. And I talked about that so long that as the Anti-Saloon League and the Women's Christian Temperance Union gained favor in the late 1800s into the early 1900s, and then the war effort and women and people like Alice Paul nationally and women in Iowa really raised the profile. And so from that period, that's why it almost passes in 1916, but there hasn't been that national kind of cataclysm like World War I, the Great War, that makes people say, and so, times of crisis can be bits of tipping points where people say, maybe we need to do things different. And so to me as a historian, I look at that activity and the progressive reforms of the early 1900s that are taking place and the changing cultural attitudes, but World War I or the Great War as being really the tipping point.
Perfect. So near the beginning of your talk, you had a list of suffrage leaders and where they're from in the state. And someone pointed out that the list doesn't include anyone from like the university community of Iowa City. And the question is, were the men of academia not primarily in favor of women's suffrage? And did that have any impact or any involvement of their spouses in the movement?
University of Iowa had a long tradition of admitting women. Johnson County did have, some significant figures. It just, for one reason or another, and I'd have to go back and look at my second slide of, the longer grouping to see if there were any Johnson County. There were people that had Johnson County connections for sure. I'm not exactly, positive, and certainly the Iowa Women's Archives has done such a great job of documenting the story along with us and the Cat Center at Iowa State and Special Collections at Iowa State and UNI also with their materials. So I honestly don't know, to be concise, why Johnson County didn't have the same level of leadership as maybe other counties. It could be connected to the liberalism, and I'm not joking, of and liberal not in the modern sense, but an openness toward alcohol, whereas Iowa State College tended to be the more conservative prohibition town, Iowa City a little less so.
Perfect. So in your talk, you mentioned Boone, Iowa was the site of one of the first suffrage parades. Were there any other large displays of pro-suffrage support in Iowa or anti-suffrage? Anti-suffrage tended to be, as we said, in those river communities especially. So that's where you saw some of the biggest voices against suffrage. And I honestly don't know, just to try to get in one more question, of any other major parades. I love the story that Sarah Agee has of,
Carrie Dean Pruin driving her Buick in 1916 around Ida County. So you have individual stories like that.
And our last question today, it seems timely given what's going on in the world, but as we know, suffrage passed right during the Great Influenza of 1918. And did that have any effect on any events such as rallies and voting at that time?
The thing to consider about the influenza pandemic of 1918 into early 1919 and even a little carryover is it was a much more defined period of illness, and the immunity developed on influenza different than it has coronavirus. So influenza really is only an effect in the off-year election of 1918. Governor Harding did have influenza during that election season of 1918. So he was running as governor because the governor term was only 2 years, recovering from influenza. So the influenza pandemic really affects Iowa from late September, early October into early of 1918 into early January of 1919. Then, much like the flu today, it ebbs a little bit, comes back in the fall of 1919 and carries over into early 1920. But it didn't have the same reach as coronavirus seems to have. So that's the short version. And thank everyone for being here today.
And thank you, Leo. And with that answer, this is all the time we have for today's webinar. I always say this every single time we get together, but I know it's been a very informative lunch. Also, thank you to everyone joining us today. We hope everyone can join us for the next webinar in this series on August 27th. There are many great stories from Iowa's past to tell in the upcoming months. For more information and to register for future webinars in this series, check out our website at iowaculture.gov. This website and past presentations are available on our website as well. While you're there, you can look into some of our other fantastic digital programs, such as the weekly Goldie at Home activities for young historians, or watch video recordings of the Iowa Story series, which is hosted by our Iowa City branch. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon. We look forward to virtually seeing you all on August 27th. Thank you.